Tonight, the cold finds the cabin before you do. It is waiting in the seams between the logs, in the floorboards, in the water bucket by the door, in the long, unbroken dark above the roof. By the time you pull the rough latch shut behind you, and stand for a moment with one hand still on the wood, the cold is already inside with you, not as a sudden enemy, but as a patient fact. That is the first truth of a frontier winter night. The cabin is never fully warm. It is only less cold than the world outside. The room is small enough that a single fire should feel powerful in it. And yet the fire does not. It crouches low in the hearth, working dutifully without display, a red heart under ash, a little line of flame lifting now and then, as if remembering how. It smells of oak smoke and damp wool and old straw, and the faint ghost of cornmeal from supper. The walls are pine logs, rough-hewn, darkened by smoke. Still, carrying the long memory of the forest in their knots and resin lines. Between them, clay and moss and dried grass have been pressed into the cracks by determined hands. But winter is always better at finding weaknesses than tired people are at sealing them. You stand quietly and listen. The cabin is speaking in its night voice. A light crack from the far wall, where cold tightens the wood. A soft movement in the rafters, the low breath of the dog already turning in circles near the bed. The deeper sleeping breaths of children who learned early that winter is something the body must live through without wasting much thought on complaint. And outside, beyond the timber walls, beyond the snow-dark yard, beyond the woodpile and the half-frozen well, the pines are answering the wind in a language that sounds almost like water if you are tired enough. By daylight, this place can look nearly sufficient. That is one of the tricks sunlight plays on the poor. In daylight, the cabin seems practical, even brave. The roof holds, the chimney stands, the walls are upright. There is a bed, a table, a shelf, a peg with coats, a bucket, a kettle, a rifle, a few precious candles, and a family. Enough, daylight says, but night corrects the lie. Night reveals what the house truly is. A wooden pause in the wilderness, a fragile box of heat and breath, built quickly against a season that does not care how tired you are. You pull off your outer cloak and hang it near the fire, though never too near. Nothing near the hearth can be trusted without watching, and nothing that catches flame in the night can be forgiven. Your boots are stiff with old dampness and rubbed pale at the seams. When you sit to pull them free, your fingers ache from the cold even before the colder air reaches your socks. The floor beneath your feet feels as if the earth itself has risen to meet you through the planks. This is not the friendly cold of a winter walk taken for pleasure. This is the cold that enters by patience, that works upward through the heel, the ankle, the knee, and settles where the body is weakest. Your bed waits in the corner, if bed is the right word for a frame of rough wood holding a coarse tick of straw and dried husks. There are nights when the body is so exhausted it blesses any horizontal surface. There are other nights when even exhaustion cannot persuade the bones to enjoy such arrangements. The straw inside the ticking has shifted over weeks of use, gathering in one place, flattening in another, compressing under hips, knees, and shoulders into a geography that the body remembers even when the mind does not. When you lower yourself onto it, the straw gives a dry little sound, and the whole thing smells faintly of chaff and old dust and winter clothing that has not fully dried since the last snowfall. The blanket is heavy and not enough. That is also true of the quilt folded beneath it, and the wool layer under that, and the coat you will sleep in rather than hang up. Heat on the frontier is rarely denied outright. It is merely too thinly spread. Every covering works a little. None works fully. Warmth comes by accumulation, not abundance. One layer, then another body, then the dog, then the habit of keeping the knees drawn in, then the memory of yesterday's fire still faintly trapped in the mattress stuffing, then the small mercy of sleeping with your cap on, then the little square of extra cloth tucked at the neck where drafts like to find a throat. This is how a settler family builds sleep, by accumulation, by compromise, by little dishonesties told to the body. You tell the body that the straw is softer than it is because there is no benefit in admitting otherwise. You tell the body that the blanket is warmer than yesterday, even if the only real difference is that everyone settled into it more quickly tonight. You tell the children that their toes will warm soon, because saying it aloud helps make them patient enough to wait for the slow rise of heat inside the bed. On the frontier, Comfort is often a form of cooperation between fact and hope. The clothing does much of the work the cabin cannot do. You sleep in what you wore by day, because undressing would be another kind of folly. The shirt stays on, the wool outer garment stays on, stockings. If they are dry enough to deserve the name, stay on too. The women sometimes loosen what must be loosened for nursing, or to keep circulation in their hands and feet from going numb beneath too many tight wrappings. But no one treats night clothes as a separate category from day clothes, unless fortune has entered the household in unusual quantity. Cloth is too dear, laundering too difficult, and warmth too scarce for such refinements. The body learns to do what the century asks of it. A frontier quilt is therefore never merely bedding. It is an archive of rationed softness. Each patch is a salvage decision. A strip from the sleeve of a shirt too worn to mend again. A square cut from a dress faded past public use. A little triangle from a child's garment kept not because the cloth was especially strong, but because sentiment and scarcity so often become allies in poor households. You can feel the different fabrics with your fingers even in the dark. One smoother, one rougher, one so often washed and worn that it has become almost tender compared to the others. The quilt records the family more faithfully than many written documents ever could. Then there is the straw itself, the humble, crackling foundation of the whole business. Fresh straw sleeps differently from old straw. That is something only people who must care about such matters ever really learn. Fresh stuffing still holds air. It lifts the body a little from the frame beneath. It smells faintly of field and dry sunlight. Old straw, by contrast, collapses inward under repeated use. It turns dusty. It forms hollows. It begins to remember where each person lies, and resists being persuaded into any kinder arrangement. Families restuff their ticks when they can, but the ability to do so depends on season, stores, labor, and whether other needs have already consumed the available plant matter. Even bedding competes with survival. Straw suitable for sleep might also be wanted for livestock, for stuffing a draft gap, for stabilizing some wet corner of floor, for kindling when nothing else is dry enough. So people adapt themselves to the bed rather than demanding that the bed adapt to them. Children are the quickest at this. They turn sideways, they curl. They press forehead to shoulder, knees to belly, heels against another warm leg. They sleep in postures that look almost uncomfortable to a modern eye, and yet hold heat beautifully. Adults do the same more reluctantly, because adults remember what more space once felt like. Memory makes discomfort sharper. A child born into frontier conditions often finds them more natural than a grown person who has known otherwise. This is one reason the older settlers carry a different sort of fatigue from the young. Their bodies are tired, yes, but so are their comparisons. At the foot of the bed, the dog may already know by scent what kind of night this will be. Dogs on the frontier are companions, guards, alarm systems, scavengers, and one more source of warmth when weather grows mean enough to justify their presence indoors. A dog's body does not ask permission from etiquette. It only offers heat and receives it. The children love this. The adults pretend they merely tolerate it. Winter decides the argument on the bitterest nights, if the household is poor enough and the weather sharp enough. Other creatures may also become part of the indoor economy. A lamb too weak to survive the barn, a piglet not yet hardy, a hen brought closer to the hearth after some evidence of freezing in the coop. Each such decision erodes the old boundary between human dwelling and animal shelter. Yet on the frontier that boundary was never as grand as later memory likes to imagine. Survival blurs categories quickly. Warm blood is warm blood. The bed therefore becomes a small republic of necessity. No one lies where they would purely choose. They lie where the heat makes most sense. The weakest go nearer the middle. The stronger take the outer edges. A mother keeps one arm free if she can. Not for comfort, but so she can reach the child most likely to wake. A father might sleep nearer the side from which he would rise fastest to the hearth or the door. Even unconsciousness is arranged strategically. You begin to see that rest here is not the opposite of planning. It is planning carried into the dark until the body finally takes over. And yet, for all this calculation, tenderness keeps entering. The child whose cold foot finds your leg in the dark is not conducting an elegant heat exchange. The dog pressing closer is not participating in domestic theory. A wife pulling the blanket higher over her husband's shoulder after he has fed the fire does not think of herself as managing thermal loss. Love and survival on the frontier are often the same gesture described in different languages. This is what gives the scene its strange softness. Everything is practical, and therefore everything is intimate. Even the order of sleep has a family logic. The children go down first, or first in effect, though adults may still be speaking softly by the hearth. The baby drifts in pieces, surfacing and sinking as babies do, indifferent to any theory of proper rest. The adults remain longest in the borderland between wakefulness and true sleep, because they have the most to keep track of and the deepest habit of mentally counting tomorrow before surrendering anything to dreams. By the time the room fully settles, the quilt has become less a blanket than a landscape shared by several bodies, each contributing something small to the other's chances of reaching dawn less damaged than they might have otherwise. If this sounds humble, it is. If it sounds heroic, it is that too, though frontier families themselves would not have used the word. Heroism suggests ceremony, and there is nothing ceremonial here. Only repetition, only one more night, arranged well enough that the children will wake with fingers that still bend. Only one more night in which the dog's warmth at the feet, the mother's shoulder at the center, the father's coat thrown over the top, and the patient heat of bodies laid close together make a room not comfortable, but possible. And in conditions like these, possible is a profound form of mercy. Not by making a room comfortable, but by constructing, from whatever remains at the end of the day, a pocket of survivable warmth large enough for breathing bodies to drift in and out of rest. Dull. The children are already there, arranged according to a logic older than sentiment and kinder than convenience. The youngest sleeps nearest the center, where two adults can hold a little island of warmth around a body too small to generate enough for itself. An older child curls against your wife's side, knees up, chin tucked down, instinctively making less of himself so the blanket can manage its poor work better. Another lies at the outside edge, but has twisted toward the center even in sleep, his hands finding heat without conscious thought. The dog, admitted by no formal vote and by every winter necessity, takes the foot of the bed, as though it were born to understand the arithmetic of shared survival. You slide in carefully. There is a moment each night when the body first meets the cold side of the bed and recoils at it. The straw holds the day's chill as faithfully as it held the day's shape. For a little while it feels as though the cold will never soften. Then body heat starts its patient work. The child beside you presses closer. Your wife's shoulder is a line of warmth through cloth. The dog sighs and settles. The quilt is drawn a little tighter. A small pocket forms around breath and blood. It is never luxury. It is simply enough. The idea of enough changes on the frontier. Elsewhere, enough might mean comfort, privacy, a mattress stuffed with feathers, a fire tended by someone else, shutters thick enough to keep the wind sounding distant rather than intimate. Here, enough means this, that the baby's hands are warm under the blanket, that the dog's breath at your feet is not the breath of a dying animal, that no snow is falling directly through the roof tonight, that there are still coals alive in the hearth, that the water bucket is not frozen solid, that the north wall whistles but does not open, that the wolves stay far enough out in the timber to sound like part of the landscape rather than an approaching threat. Your wife says very little now. Words waste heat in their own way, and the frontier teaches people how to save language for daylight tasks. Still, a glance passes between you as the baby settles and the older children stop shifting. It is the glance of two people who have long since lost privacy and not yet lost tenderness. Tenderness here must fit itself into smaller places. A hand under the blanket finding another hand for a moment. A shoulder turn so the other can sleep less exposed to the draft. The shared understanding that when the fire must be fed before dawn, whoever wakes first will rise without complaint. You lie still and listen to the room. Breathe. The cabin is never entirely silent. Silence would almost be worse. Silence might mean snow falling thick enough to smother every sound, with a sort of atmospheric stillness that makes every distant crack carry too clearly. Instead, there is always some low conversation between materials. Wood settling, ash sliding, wind testing, a mouse moving in the wall with the confidence of a creature that has already measured your food stores and found you wanting in vigilance. The dog's color, giving one faint scrape against the bed frame. A child sighing through his nose, the very small sucking noises of the baby dreaming or nursing half asleep. The frontier night is full of such intimate proofs that life continues, however roughly, from one hour to the next. You once slept differently, whether that memory belongs to childhood or merely to the stories older relatives told. It remains with a strange brightness. A house with more than one room, glass in the windows, a chimney that drew well, walls plastered smooth enough not to breathe cold through every seam. Perhaps feather bedding, perhaps not, but something softer than straw. A sleep that did not need to share space with the day's boots. Rifle, cooking pot, and the total economy of family survival. Perhaps that past was not as gentle as memory now insists. Memory is generous to lost comfort. Still, you know enough to feel the contrast here. Rest is not the background of life. It is one more frontier task. That task begins long before the body lies down. It begins in late afternoon, when the light lowers and every decision turns toward the night. How much wood remains split and dry, which pieces are best for the evening meal, and which must be reserved for the hours after midnight. Whether the ash bed in the hearth is deep enough to bank the coals well. Whether the cracks in the door need another strip of cloth pressed there. Whether the children's stockings have dried enough by the fire to be worn again. Whether a second hide should be taken down from the peg because the wind is moving from the north now rather than the west. Whether the dog looks healthy enough to spend the night inside, and whether the piglets are small enough to justify the same kindness? Though kindness is not the right word for it. Practicality makes strange companions on the frontier. You have heard of families bringing piglets into the cabin for the coldest nights. Perhaps you have done it yourself. If so, you already know how quickly sentiment changes shape when survival enters. The piglet is not a pet. It is one more source of heat. It smells badly. It protests. It roots where it should not. It offends every notion of order, and yet in the dead center of January, when the room falls close to freezing by dawn, and the children's noses burn red even in sleep, a warm creature under the bed frame or near the far edge of the hearth can begin to look almost providential. This is how the frontier rearranges dignity. Things once thought beneath notice become dear. A good ember, a dry sock, a roof that leaks less than last winter, a dog that knows when to bark, a child who has stopped coughing, a sack of straw recently restuffed, a neighboring woman who knows how to cut a quilt so that one blanket can hold warmth more faithfully than two badly stitched ones, a husband who returns before the hardest part of the storm, a wife who can judge by the wind alone whether the chimney will smoke poorly tonight, a spring that has not frozen over entirely, a morning when the fire catches quickly. In more comfortable worlds, these would be detailed. Here, they are the architecture of sleep. You begin at last to drift. Not fully, frontier drifting is cautious. Thoughts do not disappear at once. They loosen one by one, the woodpile first, then the north wall, then whether the chicken coop will hold if the snowfall deepen, then whether the creek can still be crossed tomorrow if the ice thickens as the moon suggests it might. Then even these begin to dissolve into the simpler sensations of the bed. The pressure of the child against your arm, the heat gathering slowly behind your knees, the dog's warmth at your feet, the little guarded glow still alive in the hearth. Then the cabin cracks sharply in the cold. You are awake again before thinking. This is how the frontier trains the body, not into panic, but into instant attendance. The first winter, such sounds might have thrown you upright, heart pounding, certain a roof beam had split or a section of wall had given way. Now you know better. There is the quick report of wood tightening under deep cold. There is the slower groan of a roof settling under fresh snow. There is the brittle pop of ice thickening at the water bucket. There is the soft brush of something small in the wall. Too light to be a serious danger, too persistent to be worth chasing in the dark. You sort sounds by habit the way others sort letters on a page. Outside, the wind is stronger now. It comes across the clearing with less softness than before, forcing the pines to answer. The cabin takes the pressure with a set of low complaints. you know almost as well as you know your children's sleeping breaths. A weaker person might say the cabin feels alive. A more practical one would say it is a machine of imperfect resistance. Both are true. The walls expand and contract, the roof lifts slightly and settles again. The chimney draws, then hesitates, then draws harder. The door latch shivers in its loop. Shelter is not passive. It spends the night working. You think of the day you built it. It had seemed possible then, perhaps because necessity makes almost anything seem possible until the body has time to object. Trees were felled with urgency, branches stripped, logs dragged, rolled, levered into place. Hands blistered, shoulders burned. Neighbors came because frontier life would be impossible without the old compact of mutual labor. Today, for you, tomorrow for me, walls rose in a day. If enough backs bent together, the roof took longer, the chimney longer still. The door never fit perfectly. The window opening was patched more than designed. There was no time for craftsmanship in the refined sense. There was no time for craftsmanship in the refined sense. Only time for adequacy. Winter was coming. It always comes faster than the hopeful imagine. That is why the cabin remains rough, not because the builders lack pride, but because weather outran perfection. Next summer, you promised yourself, the chinking would be redone more carefully. Next summer, the roof would be checked end to end and the weakest shingles replaced. Next summer, perhaps a loft could be added for the older children. Next summer, perhaps a second bed frame. Next summer, perhaps shutters that fit better. Maybe even one pane of glass if money and distance and luck align in a way they seldom do. The frontier runs on next summer, almost as much as it runs on firewood. Hope itself becomes a building material, yet here in the middle of the night, the cabin is what it is, and asks to be loved in that form. Not admired, loved. Admiration belongs to finished things, to smooth surfaces and generous rooms. Love often belongs to what saves us badly, but sufficiently. The cabin is like that. Its floor is hard, its bed is poor. Its walls leak narrow rivers of cold. The chimney smokes when the wind turns. Mice find the stores. The door swells in spring and rattles in winter. And still, you feel gratitude toward it that borders on devotion. Because outside these logs lies a darkness wider and less forgiving than any human body can bear, unprotected. Another sound comes from beyond the walls, this one deeper, a branch breaking under snow, somewhere beyond the yard. Not near enough to matter, you register it and let it pass. Then an owl again, farther out. Then only the wind and the cabin, and your own breath visible in little clouds when the blanket slips. Your wife is awake now too, though she does not speak. You know by the minute shift in her body, by the attention in her breathing, by the way one hand has settled over the baby without seeming to move there. This too is frontier sleep. The body learns to wake in fractions. One part dreams while another stands watch. The mind never descends entirely. It leaves a lantern burning in some inner hall, not because the frontier is pure terror. It is not. Such exaggerations belong to later storytellers, but because danger here is ordinary enough that no sensible person forgets it. A fever can rise fast in a child. A spark can leap from the hearth. A roof can fail under wet snow. A horse can break from its tether. Wolves can come too near the pen. Neighbors can be days away if roads turn to ice. A husband can be gone hunting and not return by dark. A stranger can approach in weather bad enough that turning anyone away would feel almost sinful, and letting him in might still prove foolish. The frontier gives the night more decisions than a body at rest would prefer. And yet, people sleep. That is the wonder of it. Perhaps the truest one in the whole subject. They do sleep, lightly, badly, in fragments, interrupted, huddled, clothed, listening, but they do. Human beings are more adaptable than comfort lets them remember. Give a family enough exhaustion, enough shared warmth, enough ritual, enough repetition, and even in a room like this, sleep will come in portions large enough to keep life moving. Tonight, as on many nights, the coming of sleep is tied to the fire. It is never only the bed that matters. It is the knowledge that before dawn someone will rise, that the coals will not be abandoned, that the room will not be allowed to descend all the way into ice. This promise, unspoken but reliable, softens the mind. One can sleep more deeply when one trusts another body in the room to answer the hearth, if one's own body fails to wake in time. You have built that trust through repetition, through 100 winter nights, through mornings when your wife fed the fire before you woke, through nights when you rose first and came back to bed with feet burning from the cold floor and hands scorched pink by sudden heat, through illness when one of you watched the baby while the other slept in snatches, through storms, through thaw leaks, through the long counting of sacks and candles and animal feed. Marriage on the frontier is not only affection and not only labor, but an exchange of vigilance so constant it becomes the shape of love itself. At last, the first deep drift comes. It carries you nowhere grand. Frontier dreams, when they begin under such conditions, often travel toward plain mercies. A dry morning, a roof that holds, children older and stronger. Spring mud instead of winter ice, a field sown in time, a quilt finished, a cow calved safely. The body dreams according to its hungers. Then the coldest hour arrives and wakes you. You know it instantly by the air in your nose, by the pain in your fingertips before you move them, by the sense that the room has withdrawn its little store of borrowed warmth and gone back to its truer state. This is the hour before dawn, when the banked fire sinks lowest and winter seems determined to prove that human effort was always temporary. You ease yourself from the bed with the caution of long habit, lifting the blanket only enough to escape and no more. One of the children turns but does not wake. Your wife murmurs something that might be your name, or might be only the half-language of sleep. The floor is savage. Cold strikes through your stockings, as if the boards were not wood at all, but river stone kept under ice. The hearth, however, still holds life. Beneath the gray ash a red seam waits. You kneel and stir it with a stick, careful not to kill it with enthusiasm. This is an old skill. Too rough a hand smothers what it means to wake. Too cautious a hand leaves the fire sulking. You feed it in stages. First, a little tinder, then a smaller split log, then your breath, slow, measured, almost intimate. The coals brighten. A small tongue of flame appears, fails, returns, and then takes hold with the particular sound dry wood makes when it accepts the inevitable. The relief is immediate and never complete. That is another frontier pattern. The fire always helps more quickly than it solves. It pushes back the cold from your hands first, then your face, then the part of the room nearest the hearth. The corners remain hostile. The floor stays cruel. The walls still breathe winter. But for a moment, kneeling there in your coat and cap, while the rest of the cabin sleeps, you feel something close to victory. Perhaps because this is the one daily battle that can be won again and again. You warm your fingers. You glance toward the bed. The children are still bundled in their shared nest of quilts and straw and dog. Your wife has turned the baby closer into the curve of her body. The room, which had been a place of endurance a moment ago, begins very slowly to become a place where sleep might continue. Then you return to bed. The cold side you left has cooled further, but the center still holds some remnant of your body's heat. You fit yourself back, between child and wife, between quilt and coat, between dog warmth and straw crackle. The frontier teaches people how to disturb sleep as little as possible. You settle with care. The blanket is drawn back into place. One child sighs and tucks a cold foot against your shin. The dog breathes out hard and resettles. The fire behind you gathers strength enough to make the wall closest the hearth begin to lose its rim of frost. This second sleep is often the kinder one, perhaps because the waking has happened, and the fire is fed, and the coldest edge of fear has passed with action. You no longer need to wonder whether the coals will hold. They did not, and then they did again under your hands. The problem has shape now, and solved problems are easier to sleep beside than uncertain ones. So you drift farther this time. It is from this deeper, later, part of the night that we can turn to Rebecca Bryan Boone. Not because her name changes the cold, but because it gives the night a face. History preserves too many frontier women only in relation to men who walked more famously through it. Daniel Boone moves through American memory with the confidence of legend. Woodsman, explorer, pathmaker, a man who kept following the edge of settlement as if he were being called by the West itself. Rebecca, by contrast, is remembered in quieter lines. Wife, mother, companion to movement, she did not narrate. But the frontier at night belonged to women like her as much as it belonged to any legendary hunter. Perhaps more, because men so often entered legend by leaving the cabin, while women entered obscurity by keeping it alive. Rebecca Bryan was born in 1739 in North Carolina, already in a world edging westward, already in a family for whom land and movement were part of survival rather than abstract ambition. When she married Daniel Boone at 17, she married into that same restlessness. It is tempting from a distance to think of such marriages romantically. Youth, wilderness, new beginnings. But marriage on the frontier was also logistics, childbirth, fire, management, repeated relocation, the packing and unpacking of a life in places where almost nothing was ready when you arrived. In the earlier years, there may have been intervals that resembled ordinary settlement life closely enough. Fields, livestock, hunting, children, spinning, mending, winter, and spring in their proper turns. Yet Daniel was not a man content to let the known ground remain sufficient once the promise of better land, more game, or farther country had entered his mind. Such men are praised by posterity. They are more difficult to live beside in real time. In 1769, he left for Kentucky, gone for years long enough that Rebecca learned again what frontier marriage often meant for women. Not only partnership, but absence. To be married to a restless man is to spend large portions of life managing alone while still carrying his name, his children, his hopes, and the practical consequences of his appetites. He returned with reports of Kentucky's richness, good land, game promise, the sort of promise that sounds bright in public retelling and heavy in a mother's private imagination. By then, Rebecca was already deep in the real arithmetic of family life. Children were not symbols of future prosperity to her. They were hungry bodies, sleeping bodies, sick bodies, beloved bodies that needed blankets, shoes, broth, mending, discipline, comfort, and watching. A move west was not only an adventure, it was another round of building from nothing while still carrying everything. So when the family joined the attempt to pass through the Cumberland Gap in 1773, Rebecca went not toward romantic opportunity, but toward another stage of relentless labor. The journey broke under violence. Her son James was killed. 16 years old, the sort of age at which a mother still sees the child under the growing man. However broad the shoulders, however serious the work already entrusted to him. Frontier history often notes such deaths in passing, as if they belong naturally to the era's harshness. But to a mother, the death of one child does not become ordinary merely because other mothers also bury sons. It becomes a room inside the body that never entirely closes. The families retreated, grief traveled back with them. That is another frontier truth that legends dislike. Retreat, failure, the West not opening but striking back through fear, exhaustion, and loss. Rebecca had no luxury to collapse under this sorrow. Other children still needed her. Food still had to be cooked. Clothes still had to be mended. Night still arrived, asking the usual things of the body even after the worst possible thing had already happened. 2 years later they tried again. This alone tells you much about frontier life. People did not simply stop because they had been broken once. Sometimes the same forces that broke them left them no tolerable alternative. Land scarcity, debt, hope, restlessness in husbands, structural pressure greater than private grief. So Rebecca went west again into Kentucky, into Boonesboro, into a life that later histories would remember for masculine daring and territorial expansion, but which from the inside often looked like mud, cold, crowding, fear, and an endless series of half-finished shelters. Boonesboro in winter did not offer proper rest. The fort meant company, which could feel safer than isolation, but it also meant noise. Cramped quarters, constant negotiation with other families, little privacy, and a quality of sleep made thin by communal unease. In a shared defensive space, one person's child crying becomes everyone's lost sleep. One family's illness becomes the room's tension. One man leaving on patrol pulls a thread through all the women who remain awake, listening to sounds beyond the walls. Rebecca slept there, not as a romantic pioneer heroine, but as a woman trying to hold children and self together inside an improvised settlement that had not yet decided whether it was a home or only a temporary defense. Later, Private cabins brought a different burden. What the fort denied in privacy, the isolated cabin denied in immediate help. Distance between families creates its own kind of cold. There is more room to breathe, yes, but also more room for danger to arrive unshared. A woman alone with children in a remote cabin, when her husband is away, hunting or scouting, learns very quickly that night is not a neutral interval between labors. It is a test of readiness, fire tended, water near enough, rifle loaded, baby watched, outside sounds identified if possible, and endured if not. Rebecca learned all of that. She gave birth repeatedly under conditions that made each pregnancy and labor an argument with distance. Weather, limited help, and the simple indifference of the land. 10 children in all, some did not live long. Child loss on the frontier was common enough to be discussed with grim familiarity, and still terrible enough to alter every subsequent sleep. There is a sentence hidden in that fact which history often refuses to say plainly. A mother who has buried children never lies down at night in the same way again. The body remembers too many possibilities, and Rebecca had more reasons than most to remain watchful. Her daughter, Jemima, was captured for a time in 1776 and rescued later, an event that became part of Boone legend in the adventurous register history prefers. But inside the cabin at night, before and after the rescue, what remained was maternal terror. Once one child has died violently, and another has been taken, even if only briefly, night develops an added meaning. Darkness no longer conceals only weather, animals, and ordinary accident. It also conceals the return of the unimaginable. This is how light sleep becomes not a habit, but a physiology. Rebecca likely learned, as many frontier women learned, to rise fully alert from near sleep at the smallest wrong sound. A shift in the baby's breathing, a movement outside, the fire pulling oddly in the chimney, the horse stamping too hard, the dog giving one bark, and then silence. Women like her could not afford the deep, heavy oblivion modern people often treat as natural. Their sleep became layered, one layer down in exhaustion, one layer up in vigilance, always, and still, the ordinary work went on. Water from the spring, wood from the pile, thread spun, cloth woven, meals crouched over the hearth, children taught, sick children held, clothing patched until the patch became the garment. Winter layers dried, worn, dried again, never fully clean, only sufficiently dry and warm enough not to freeze the body. Pregnancy and nursing and grief were all expected to fit themselves around these routines because there was nowhere else for them to go. This is why Rebecca belongs not in the margins of the story, but near its center. Her life clarifies what frontier sleep really meant. It meant that the most exhausted person in the household was often the one least permitted to sleep deeply. Men on the frontier labored brutally and dangerously, and many died before age granted them much gentleness. That truth remains, but the night belonged differently to women, especially women with infants, young children, pregnancies, or a husband, absent often enough that the cabin itself seemed to rest against their vigilance. Rebecca's life allows us to feel that difference from the inside. Picture her after one of Daniel's long absences. The day has already consumed her. Water carried from a spring that is farther than the children remember, and never as near as the body wants it to be. Corn ground or pounded, ashes sifted, laundry perhaps attempted in weather almost too cold to tolerate wet cloth. A child punished, another comforted socks, patched, meat salted, beans sorted, a little spinning done by weak light, because if no spinning is done, no thread exists later for mending. And if no mending is done, the winter enters through knees and elbows as readily as it enters through cabin walls. The body has not stopped once, except to shift from one necessity to another. Then evening comes, which should feel like relief, and often does not, because evening means the world grows less visible, precisely when the responsibility for every hidden danger becomes more concentrated in one person. Is that sound only a loose shutter, or something near the pen? Did the horse settle properly before dark? Is the baby too warm or too cool beneath the blanket? Is the child at the edge of the bed, coughing from ordinary smoke or beginning another sickness? Did the fire get banked deeply enough? Was the latch checked? Is the rifle primed? Are the powder horn and shot dry enough? A frontier mother does not merely lie down at the end of such a day. She enters a shift in which the room is darker, the stakes higher, and the body more tired than the mind is willing to admit. Rebecca knew this rhythm through repetition so intense it became character. She bore children into it. That alone should force us to slow down. Pregnancy on the frontier was not a pause in labor, but labor with another labor growing inside it. The body that hauled water also housed an unborn child. The body that bent over the hearth also endured nausea, back pain, swelling, worry, and the awareness that birth itself might come with very little skilled help. Some women had neighbors close enough to summon, some had mothers or sisters, some had no one in the right hour except the children old enough to fetch water. Old cloths, stand bewildered, and obey. Birth stories from the frontier are often told briefly because brevity protects the listener. But Rebecca's life reminds us that every child added another long thread of interrupted nights to an already worn mind. Then the frontier exacted payment anyway. Infant mortality, fever, weakness, accidents, the thousand ways a child might slip from a household before language had fully settled in the mouth. Rebecca lost children, as so many women did, and the surviving record can say it in a sentence while the body that lived it would have known it as a permanent division in time. Before that child, after that child, before the grave, after the small clothes were put away or cut down for reuse because cloth could not afford mourning forever. Before sleep became a place where one reached for a small body in the dark, out of habit, and touched only blanket. Grief on the frontier had to coexist with continuity. This may be one of the hardest truths in the entire subject. There was rarely room for the full luxury of collapse. Bread still had to be mixed, fire still had to be kept. Surviving children still had to be watched, a grave could be dug in frozen ground, and the same hands might still have to scrub a pot before nightfall. That does not mean the grief was smaller, it means the frontier asked women to carry grief while continuing to behave as though the ordinary machinery of life had not been torn open. In the night, that grief returned differently, not always as tears, sometimes as listening, sometimes as the inability to sleep deeply, even when every child presently alive is breathing under the quilt. Sometimes as a dream, sometimes as the conviction that danger is nearest precisely when the room has gone still. This is the emotional climate in which women like Rebecca became what later generations might call hypervigilant, though they themselves would have called it sense, or habit, or simply motherhood. They did not experience it as a diagnosis. They experienced it as the only respectable way to keep a family alive in uncertain country. And then there was the strange loneliness of being married to a man the world remembers. For motion, Daniel Boone's absences were not merely geographical facts. They shaped the pressure inside Rebecca's nights. The public story praises his skill in the woods, his tracking, his capacity to move through dangerous country, his eye for roots, his appetite for new land. The private story asks a different set of questions. Who listened for trouble while he was gone? Who calmed the children when wolves sounded too near? Who did the ordinary labor that makes other people's adventures materially possible? Who slept beside an empty space in the bed and learned to keep one ear open toward the door? The answer is almost always some woman history treated as support rather than subject. This is why Rebecca's life should not be read simply as adjunct to Daniel's. She represents a frontier discipline, at least as difficult as exploration. The discipline of remaining, the discipline of making a place hold together while another person follows his larger desire into forests. Negotiations, hunts, surveys, or dreams of the West. Remaining is less dramatic than venturing. It is also what allows venturing to keep receiving credit. A man can become legend, partly because someone else kept the household from collapse while he was away courting legend. The older Rebecca grew, the more these nights must have accumulated in her body as knowledge. Not abstract knowledge, not historical knowledge, knowledge in the spine. In the ear, in the startled response, in the way she likely woke to wrong sounds before others even named them as sounds. People who live long in precarious conditions become attuned to tiny deviations. A child's breathing slightly too shallow, a horse not stamping at the usual hour, a silence where there ought to be one board creaking in the wind. Such knowledge has survival value, but it is expensive. It charges sleep for the privilege, That is why accounts of Rebecca in old age matter so much. Even after danger had changed shape, even after years had carried her into another country and toward widowhood, she still woke lightly. The frontier had entered her sleep and remained there. A woman can outlive raids, hard winters, migrations, and husbands, and still continue listening as if the next threat were just beyond the wall. That afterlife of vigilance may be one of the truest legacies of frontier existence. Not only graves and place names and famous trails, but nervous systems permanently altered by long practice in uncertainty. And yet she found small comforts, because people must or else go mad. A child's healthy laugh after weeks of worry, a morning when the spring is easier to reach because the path has frozen firm. A quilt finally finished enough to hold 2 children under one layer. A summer night warm enough that the cabin door can remain open. A husband home before dark, corn drying well, beans enough, a harvest not ruined. The frontier did not offer continuous comfort, but it did offer flashes of it, and those flashes mattered more precisely because they were not guaranteed. This is the texture Rebecca gives the script. She keeps the subject from becoming merely atmospheric. The cold, the logs, the fire, the wolves, the prayer, the night sounds. All of that is true and necessary. But once her life enters the story, the listener understands what such things cost the human body over decades, especially the female body asked to bear, nurse, soothe, cook, mend, watch, and grieve, without ever fully putting down any one burden before another arrived. So when we speak of sleep on the frontier after Rebecca, we are no longer speaking only of temperature. We are speaking of moral labor, emotional labor, maternal labor. The long, mostly unrecorded art of staying light enough in sleep to hear danger and soft enough in spirit to keep loving the people whose need makes such light sleep necessary. That is not a side note to frontier history. It is one of its deepest hidden centers, not simply discomfort, not merely cold, sleep on the frontier. Especially for wives and mothers, was a negotiation between duty and surrender. One could not fully surrender because someone else in the cabin might need you before dawn. A baby might stir, a child might cough, a fire might drop too low, a husband might still not be home, a noise might be nothing or not nothing, and the only person there to decide which was you. Even in old age, after Missouri, after more moves than a body ought to endure. After Daniel's death, the watchfulness remained. That detail matters to me, old Rebecca waking at sounds that no longer signaled real danger. Listening with a body trained by decades of frontier nights, because it tells us that the frontier was not just geography. It was nervous memory. A woman can leave a place and still carry its darkness in the arrangement of her sleep. And she was not unique. Thousands of women did the same without leaving names strong enough to survive. Rebecca is visible because Daniel became famous, but the qualities that made her nights so hard were widespread. Her life is less valuable as an exception than as a lens. Through her, the whole hidden labor of women at the edge of settlement comes into view. They were the keepers of fire, quieters of children, patchers of blankets, listeners in the dark, and the ones who taught the household how to lie down in danger and still call it a night's rest. Around such women, the night developed rituals, not fanciful ones only, though there was fancy in them. Practical ones, protective ones, the kind people make when they know too much about vulnerability to leave it unnamed. Once the door was barred, and the fire banked, and the last candle extinguished, settlers entered a different register of experience. Night was not merely the absence of sunlight, it was a realm of thinner boundaries, between sleeping and waking, between body and soul, between the visible world and whatever the invisible might be doing just beyond the wall. Dreams mattered because so little else could be known in advance. A dream of muddy water, a dream of teeth falling out, a dream of snakes, a dream of fire, a dream of a dead relative appearing with warning or comfort. These did not function as idle curiosities for frontier families. They were read like weather signs, discussed at breakfast, carried into decisions, shared among women, sometimes recorded in journals if paper and literacy and time allowed. When the waking world offered few reliable guarantees, the sleeping world became another place to seek pattern. You can understand why. A mother who cannot protect her child from every illness, accident, attack, or winter fever will pay close attention to anything that seems to foretell trouble. Dream interpretation is, among other things, an attempt to recover agency in a life that gives very little of it. If the night sends warnings, then perhaps the dark is not entirely hostile. It may still be frightening, but at least it is legible. Prophetic dreams, or dreams remembered as prophetic, circulated widely enough to become part of the accepted frontier imagination. A woman dreamed of danger, and danger came. Another dreamed of a far relative's death before the news could arrive. Such stories were not filed under superstition by those living them. They were filed under experience. To dismiss them would have been to dismiss one of the few forms of meaning the night sometimes seemed willing to offer. Children learned this atmosphere early. They learned that sleep was a crossing place, that the soul wandered, that death and sleep used some of the same language, because both involved surrender to darkness and trust in a waking beyond one's control. They learned the bedtime prayer not as quaint poetry, but as serious preparation. If I should die before I wake, was not melodrama in a world where infants died? Fevers surged, chimneys sparked, and winter could take the week by increments. The prayer did not create fear, it gave fear a rhythm gentle enough to repeat. Near the bed, protective things gathered, a Bible under the pillow or on a shelf within reach. A smooth stone carried from an earlier home, a button from a father's coat sewn into a child's mattress ticking. A scrap of wedding cloth tucked beneath a straw. None of these objects had to operate according to modern standards of proof to do their work. Their work was partly symbolic, and therefore deeply real. They condensed attachment into matter. They said this child is held. This bed is guarded. This family lies down with memory close beside it. Quilts themselves could become a form of protection. Certain patterns were thought to confuse malevolent forces or invite blessing. Red thread for life, blue for calm, white for purity. One may smile at such systems from a warm century, but in the cold they become easier to honor. Ritual is a way of shaping helplessness into motion. A woman who cannot keep every danger from the door can still stitch with intention. She can still place the bed a certain way. She can still pray over the children. She can still bank the fire properly. These acts do not abolish danger. They make the mind more able to sleep within it. The arrangement of the room mattered too. Beds were positioned according to a blend of inherited custom and practical wisdom. Some wanted the head to the east. Some refused to have feet toward the door, where a corpse might be carried. Some mistrusted moonlight falling directly across a sleeper's face. In another age, these things might sound decorative or irrational. In a frontier cabin, they were part of the architecture of reassurance. A family that feels it has done the right thing sleeps more easily than one lying in raw uncertainty. Before the final light went out, prayer gathered the family together if the room was not too crowded and the day not too cruel for even that. Scripture, a verse, a murmured blessing, children repeating words they knew by heart, parents listening for sincerity as much as accuracy. The ritual marked a boundary. Day was ending, work was ending, protection now had to take another form. Then the last candle was pinched out, and the smell of the extinguished wick rose in the room. A smell frontier children must have associated with bedtime as powerfully as any lullaby. Darkness then became complete, in a way modern darkness rarely is. No street lamps, no foam glow, no clock face lit quietly in the corner, just blackness thick enough that the room vanished and had to be rebuilt by sound. In such dark, the human voice becomes precious. Stories, songs, the calm reassurance of parents speaking to children whose courage looked larger in twilight than it does once total black has settled over the walls. A father's story or a mother's song did more than comfort. It helped repopulate the darkness with familiar presences rather than shapeless fears. Practical knowledge moved through this nighttime world as well, and not always only from Europe. Settlers borrowed, sometimes openly and sometimes not, from native neighbors and from the wider field of indigenous knowledge around them. Raised sleeping platforms kept bodies away from the earth's cold pull. Bark mats trapped air, hides layered well could outperform poor woven cloth. Smoke treatment of certain materials had uses beyond odor. The frontier did not reward cultural purity half so much as it rewarded adaptation. Where warmth was scarce, wisdom traveled farther than pride liked to admit. So a family might say Christian prayers over a bed arranged partly by habits learned from indigenous practice. They might fear old-world night spirits while sleeping on a platform, or mat better suited to the American environment than anything they had used before. They might carry folk beliefs across the Atlantic and modify them quietly in the cabin without public acknowledgement. This too is part of frontier sleep culture, not a pure inheritance, but a practical braid. The night itself was often divided, first sleep, then waking, then second sleep. This older rhythm has become strange to the modern imagination because we are taught to think of healthy sleep as one unbroken descent. But in the frontier cabin, the divided night feels not only normal, but almost elegant in its usefulness. The body, once the first exhaustion is spent, rises again naturally in the middle hours. Not fully into daytime wakefulness, only into a soft alertness. Enough to stir the coals, shift a child, visit the chamber pot, whisper a prayer, listen to the weather, perhaps even exchange a few quiet words with the one other adult still sharing the room's deepest burdens. There is a special emotional weather to this wakeful interval. The cabin is darker than evening and not yet touched by dawn. The first pressure of falling asleep has already passed, taking with it much of the day's mental noise. What remains is a quieter self, the one that notices the dog's breathing, the one that hears the ash settle on the coals, the one that becomes aware of just how many bodies are trusting the room at once. In later centuries, people would fear such waking, call it insomnia, resist it. On the frontier, it was often simply part of the architecture of rest. This interval also left room for folk explanations of what happened in sleep to grow more vivid. Hag riding, for instance, what we would now call sleep paralysis, made dreadful sense in a cabin where darkness had weight, and the line between dream and waking could feel thin enough to tear. A person wakes, cannot move, feels pressure on the chest, senses a hostile presence in the room, and no modern medical language is available to dissolve the terror. Of course, this became spiritualized. Of course, people reached for remedies, a broom by the bed so the intrusive force might be compelled to count the bristles. Shoes angled a certain way, a knife placed beneath the pillow, salt at the threshold. None of these needed to be scientifically effective to be emotionally powerful. They offered an answer where otherwise there would only have been helplessness. The wise women of the frontier moved through this world with a complicated authority. They knew herbs, signs, prayers, seasonal beliefs, remedies for bad dreams, ways to soothe children after night terrors, ways to interpret the difference between an ordinary nightmare and one the household should treat as warning. Communities depended on them and distrusted them in equal measure, as communities often do with women whose knowledge cannot be fully folded into official religion or male rationality. A woman troubled by recurring nightmares might be told to place certain plants beneath the pillow, or to turn a garment inside out, or to speak a prayer while walking backward to bed. Such advice sounds quaint only if one ignores its psychological force. Ritual gives the frightened mind steps to follow. Steps lead toward calm. Calm leads toward sleep. Herbs belong to the same borderland between medicine and meaning. Chamomile, valerian, lavender, mugwort, each carried practical effects, symbolic associations, or both. A warm infusion before bed could genuinely quiet the body. A sprig in the mattress could stand for protection even if the chemistry mattered less than the scent. The frontier was not foolish about plants. It was intimate with them. A household that lived half a day's ride from a doctor, and farther still from certainty, paid attention to whatever eased cough, fever, stomach pain, fear, or wakefulness. Sleep culture was never separate from the wider domestic pharmacology of the cabin. And then there were the dead. Frontier people spoke of death through the language of sleep so often that the two states began to lean toward one another in the imagination. Eternal rest, resting place, sleep in Jesus, gone to sleep. This was not sentimental evasion alone. It was a conceptual bridge, sturdy enough to carry grief across nights, when grief otherwise might have made rest impossible. To tell a child that a sibling or parent had gone to a longer sleep was to bring catastrophe closer to something the child already practiced each night. It softened terror by borrowing familiarity. The practice worked in both directions. Bedtime itself became a small rehearsal for mortality. Prayers were serious because one might not wake, not in some rhetorical spiritual sense, but in the very physical frontier sense that children died. Fevers rose, chimneys sparked, and old wounds turned bad at inconvenient hours. This did not make frontier families macabre, it made them exact. The possibility of death lived near enough that the language of rest had to accommodate it. The middle watch of the night was therefore not just practical time. It was liminal time. A person lying awake between first and second sleep might feel especially aware of the thinness of ordinary protection. The fire is low, but alive. Everyone else is breathing. The dark outside is still complete. The door holds. For a moment, the room seems suspended between worlds. Not only between evening and morning, but between labor and dream, fear and calm, life and whatever comes after life. It is easy to see why such hours generated visions, prayers, and folk certainties. The mind is suggestible there, but also piercing. Some of the clearest thoughts people ever have arrive in that interval, when the day no longer intrudes and the second sleep has not yet taken them. This may be one reason frontier spirituality often feels so physical. It was not a religion of polished abstractions first. It was a religion of bodies in danger, bodies in labor, bodies in childbirth, sickness, bodies under blankets listening to weather, bodies trying to sleep while knowing they could not entirely afford to. Prayer, ritual, and belief entered sleep culture, because sleep was one of the points at which the body felt most dependent, and therefore most open to help from beyond itself. And it is here that borrowing from native traditions becomes especially revealing. Dream catchers, however commercialized and emptied of meaning they later became, were not to frontier adopters merely decorative curiosities. In the Great Lakes regions and beyond, ideas about dreams, bad influences, sleeping direction, materials, and spiritual filtration circulated in ways settlers could not entirely avoid if they lived near indigenous peoples long enough. Not everyone adopted such things. Many would have rejected them publicly, yet in private, in the cabin, where children cried at bad dreams and adults feared what arrived in the body at night, practical or symbolic help from any direction could become welcome. The frontier was a harsh editor of ideological purity. Archaeology hints at all this in its quiet way. A charm buried beneath a hearthstone, a folded prayer, a button or coin placed where no purely utilitarian explanation fully satisfies. A Bible worn most at the edges read before sleep. The compressed remains of straw ticks showing how bodies curled inward. Candle fragments near sleeping areas. These are small survivals, but sleep culture itself is built from small survivals. Rarely do people leave grand monuments to the way they banked coals or laid children down. They leave traces. The traces must be read tenderly, so the divided night is more than an old sleeping pattern. It is a chamber in which all these elements gather. Fire tending, dream interpretation, prayer, herbal comfort, fear of paralysis or visitation, the language of death as rest, the body's natural waking, the mother listening, the father checking the latch, the child murmuring in a dream, the hidden object in the straw, the knife beneath the pillow, the little line of salt, the sense that one is not fully alone in the room, even when every visible body belongs to the family. If you sit there long enough in imagination, the interval becomes deeply calm. Not because it is free of fear, but because fear has been given so many soft containers. Ritual is one of those containers, repetition is another, shared belief is a third. The coals hold, the room breathes. The family remains in place. The night is not empty chaos, but a known path walked many times, even if each walk contains uncertainty. Then the second sleep arrives. It comes more quietly because the mind has already done its little night work. The fire has been checked, the prayer said again or remembered, the child soothed, the wind interpreted, the body lies down for the second time, not without danger, but with danger renamed, and therefore slightly reduced. That is one of the gentlest frontier arts, not abolishing fear, but making it small enough to sleep beside. First sleep, then waking in the deep middle hours, then second sleep. This older rhythm, common in earlier centuries, suited frontier conditions surprisingly well. It allowed the fire to be tended, the chamber pot to be used, animals to be checked by ear, if not by lantern, children to be soothed, prayer to be said in the stillest hour. It also meant no one was unconscious for the entire span of danger. The night became a series of negotiated passages rather than one long fall. There is something soothing about that once you stop measuring it by modern standards. Between first sleep and second sleep, the cabin floats in a special kind of quiet. The coals breathe low. The family lies mostly still. One or two people wake enough to stir the fire, speak a few words, or simply listen. This interval belongs neither to full labor nor to full rest. It is a middle country on the frontier. Middle countries are often where life is actually lived. And then there was the language linking sleep and death. Eternal rest, sleep in the Lord, gone to rest. The dead were laid down almost as the living were laid down. Except that the waking would come in another register and another world. To a modern mind, such language can sound severe for children to hear nightly. Yet for frontier families surrounded by infant loss, epidemics, accident, and violent uncertainty, it offered continuity rather than terror. Bedtime became a rehearsal for trust. If one did not wake, one was still not lost, one had merely entered a longer sleep, watched by the same God invoked before every winter night. This did not remove grief, it did not prevent nightmares. It did not stop mothers from feeling a child's chest in the dark to make sure breath still moved. But it gave the mind a bridge where otherwise there would have been only a chasm. Not all cabins knew these nights equally. This is the part of the story that comes late and should. Somewhere else on the same frontier, behind thicker walls or brick, with a servant to rise first and a fire already mended before dawn, another family slept differently. A merchant prosperous enough to profit from settlement. A garrison officer, a land speculator, a government man sent west but still insulated by pay and status. Their rooms might have real bedsteads, feathered ticks, curtains, private chambers for husband and wife, nursery space for children. Hot water brought by another's labor, coals stirred before they had to leave the comfort of the bed. Warmth, then, was not merely a meteorological condition. It was social power. It determined who woke ready and who woke already defeated. A well-rested merchant began the day with clearer judgment than a farmer who had risen 3 times to tend a fevered child in a drafty room. An officer whose fire had been kept by another man's labor could think strategically, while a poor settler was still trying to get feeling back into his hand. A gentlewoman behind better walls might worry, and still possess the emotional surplus that comes from not being physically cold. The poor, by contrast, often entered the morning already partly spent by the night. This matters more than it first appears to matter. Sleep is not merely one need among others. It shapes one's capacity to bargain, to plan, to endure insult, to manage risk, to think patiently, to resist bad terms, to notice danger before it ripens, and to maintain a temperament others find respectable. A tired, cold, underslept person is easier to exploit than a warm and well-rested one. Frontier inequality, therefore, entered daylight through the dark. The cabin and the bed were part of the economy whether anyone named them that way or not. Consider the morning after 2 very different nights. In one home, a family rises stiff and cold. The father relights a weak fire with numb fingers. The mother has slept in pieces because the baby coughed, and the north wall whistled, and one of the boys wet the bed, and the dog barked at something in the yard. Breakfast, if it can be called breakfast, is hurried and plain. Everyone is already irritable from poor rest. Decisions made under such conditions lean toward the immediate, because the body has little strength for elegant calculation. In another home, perhaps only a few miles away, a room has been warmed before dawn by a servant. Hot water has been carried up. Children sleep separately or under the care of a nurse or older servant. The household wakes not in luxury by metropolitan standards, perhaps, but in clear relative ease. Such a family begins the day from a position of physiological advantage. They can think farther ahead because the night did not consume so much of them. That advantage compounds. A merchant who slept warm bargains with a settler who slept cold. A landowner writes terms while his tenants or would-be buyers are still carrying yesterday's fatigue in their backs and last night's interruptions in their tempers. A creditor extends or withholds mercy from a family who have no energy left to negotiate effectively. Wealth in frontier regions did not hover abstractly over social life. It entered the body through heat, bedding, privacy, and the number of uninterrupted hours one could reasonably expect from the dark. Even children were shaped by these differences. A frontier child raised in cold, crowding, and constant alertness learned early that the body must be disciplined toward endurance. Such a child slept differently, feared differently, attached differently to comfort when it appeared. If that child later prospered, the memory of deprivation might make warmth feel almost miraculous, or else suspiciously temporary. Meanwhile, a child raised in a better appointed house learned that walls held, fires returned, servants answered, and the night was something entered under protection, rather than negotiated through collective bodily effort. These children became different adults, not only because of class, but because of the nightly texture of being alive. One can see this in letters, diaries, and the social awkwardness of hospitality. Imagine a poorer settler woman invited for tea to a better house, and then returning home after dusk to her own drafty room. She has sat on upholstered furniture, perhaps, or seen curtains thick enough to keep out wind, candles used more freely than she would ever allow herself, children separated from the main sleeping quarters, a fire large enough to be decorative as well as useful. She goes home carrying not only gratitude or resentment or admiration or shame, but bodily knowledge of the contrast. She will feel her own bed more sharply that night for having touched another standard of comfort. The women in the richer household may feel something in return. Charity perhaps if they are generous, superiority perhaps if they are not, unease, if conscience has remained active beneath the cushions. Some knew very well that their relative ease depended upon structures that kept others near desperation. Others explained the disparity through virtue, providence, laziness, merit, or the convenient moral legends every unequal society teaches itself so the warm can sleep without imagining the cold too vividly. The frontier generated all of these explanations. It also generated the facts underneath them. The myth of open opportunity often hid those facts. Yes, some families rose through luck, endurance, skill, timing, or unusual access to land and trade, but many more lived and died not far above the level of daily struggle. Hard work did not guarantee comfort, and the frontier often intensified old-class structures while pretending to dissolve them. Night was where the pretense wore thin. The elite ritual of comfort and the poor ritual of endurance unfolded under the same sky, separated not by climate, but by the distribution of labor, property, and power. And still, the wind crossed both roofs. That image matters because it keeps the contrast from turning too flat. The same storm could move over cabin and manor, over crude outpost and merchant's house, over women with servants and women who were their own servants. Nature was impartial in its pressure. Human arrangements were not. The rich did not escape cold altogether. They purchased thicker barriers against it. They purchased more bodies to stand between themselves and raw necessity. They purchased time, privacy, and the ability to treat the night as something other than a collective emergency. For the poor, by contrast, night remained closer to the bone. They felt it in the walls, in the bed, in the quality of their tempers come morning, in the way debt negotiations seemed harder after a bad night, in how quickly a sick child could undo the whole household's little reserve of energy. Sleep became a hidden factor in economic life, though few would have named it that way. The underslept accepted terms the well-rested could reject. The chronically tired made decisions from depletion. Warmth, privacy, and uninterrupted rest therefore translated into influence not only within the home, but outside it. Seen this way, the history of sleep on the frontier is not a side curiosity. It is one of the places where class reveals itself most honestly. By day, ideology can cover much. Men speak of self-reliance, opportunity, destiny, industry, providence, national growth. At night, the body asks plainer questions. Are you warm enough? Is your child breathing well? Will the fire last? Can you sleep without fear? Who must wake when the coals fail? Who may remain in bed while someone else answers the hearth? Such questions expose the structure beneath the slogans. And yet here too, Tenderness persists. Some richer families did help poorer neighbors. Some shared food, cast-off clothing, labor, or temporary warmth. Such gestures mattered, even when they did not undo hierarchy. Some wealthy, or middling people felt genuine discomfort at the contrast their lives revealed. Others hardened into explanation. The frontier contained all of these moral possibilities, just as it contained both the poor ritual of endurance and the elite ritual of comfort. It is enough for us, in the darkened museum of imagination, simply to notice the divide clearly. Warmth itself was stratified, privacy was stratified, the right to unguarded sleep was stratified. Once you see that, the whole night reads differently. The dying coals in the cabin are no longer only picturesque hardship. They are part of a larger social arrangement. The featherbed in the merchant's room is no longer only comfort. It is stored labor, stored privilege, stored insulation from necessity. The two scenes belong together because each explains the other. And then, just as importantly, both must be released again. Because the frontier night, for all its inequities, still carries every sleeper toward the same surrender. Rich or poor, isolated or attended, behind log walls or brick, every human body must eventually loosen its grip on the day and lie vulnerable under darkness. That final commonality does not erase inequality, but it does lend the whole subject a strange, quiet dignity. In sleep, all hierarchies are felt through the body, and the body tells the truth more plainly than ideology does. Privacy was power too, to close a bedroom door, to speak softly without children pressed on both sides. To sleep without the dog because you choose not to, not because the dog's body heat is needed. To keep candles burning longer because tallow can be spared. To measure night by a clock on the mantle rather than by how low the coals have fallen. The elite frontier bedchamber did not float free of danger, but it stood much farther from danger than a poor settler's bed ever could. And still, even there, unease had its own forms. The merchant worried credit and debt. The officer worried supply and men, and the possibility of attack he would be blamed for failing to anticipate. A wealthy wife worried illness among her children, scarcity of competent servants, the exhausting social labor of maintaining gentility in a rough place. Comfort changed anxiety. It did not erase it, yet the difference remains profound. Anxiety under warm blankets is not the same thing as anxiety under a patched quilt in a room where the water may freeze by dawn. The frontier myth prefers to tell itself as common hardship nobly shared. Night reveals the lie by degrees. The wind touched every wall. Yes, but some walls gave way more than others. Some sleepers woke cold enough to relight their own fires. Others woke to rooms already warmed. Some children learned to sleep in a room full of family because bodies had to be used like fuel. Others learned nursery rhythms attended by servants. The need for sleep was universal. The quality of sleep never was. That contrast matters because it turns warmth into a moral as well as physical fact. The better rested negotiate from strength. The exhausted bargain poorly. A mother awake half the night with cold children is less able to resist bad credit terms from a merchant who slept warm. Structural inequality on the frontier was made not only in fields, markets, and law, but in beds. In who could surrender to night with relative safety, and who had to keep a portion of the self awake against hunger, fear, and cold. Yet even here, one truth remains strangely leveling. In deepest sleep, every human becomes helpless again. The merchant in his feather bed, the officer behind thicker walls, the mother in the drafty cabin, the child under the patched quilt. Sleep returns all bodies to dependence. The difference is only in how well the world around those bodies has been arranged to protect them. The wealthiest sleeper is still a creature trusting walls, fire, luck, and others. The poorest simply trusts thinner versions of those things. Now the night has begun to loosen. The fire you fed in the cold watch is held. The black outside the small window opening is turning first to charcoal, then to the faintest uncommitted gray. Snow piled against the north wall throws back a little more light than the bare dark did before. The shapes of the room begin returning. The peg with your cloak, the rough line of the table, the outline of the water bucket. The dog lifting its head before deciding dawn is not yet important enough to greet fully. One child wakes and then tries not to. Another burrows deeper. The baby sighs, Your wife opens her eyes and closes them once more, gathering one final minute from the dark. These last minutes before the cabin truly becomes morning are often the gentlest of the entire night. Not because the room is warm now, it is not because labor is over. It is waiting like a full day outside the door, but because the worst uncertainty has passed. The family made it through another winter night. The roof held, the fire did not die. No danger arrived greater than the usual kind. Dawn, however pale, has returned. This is what rest meant on the frontier. Not ease, not softness, not long unbroken unconsciousness. Not the modern illusion that sleep is a private retreat from the world. Rest meant enough fire, enough straw, enough cloth, enough prayer, enough shared heat, enough listening, enough courage to lie down in a fragile shelter and trust that the same fragile shelter would continue holding for a few more hours. The settlers who slept in cabins without heat did not master winter. They did not conquer the night. They did something smaller and perhaps more impressive. They learned how to construct from wood, labor, ritual, animal warmth, family closeness, and sheer repetition a little pocket of survivable darkness inside a much larger and indifferent one. That pocket was never grand. It smelled of smoke. It scratched. It leaked. It demanded tending. It had too many bodies in it, and not enough blankets. It required someone to wake before dawn, and someone else to sleep lightly until then. It carried fear, grief, folk belief, and the unfinished business of every day to the next morning. And still, it held children, it held marriages, it held mothers half awake, it held fathers on cold floors bending over coals, it held dogs at the foot of the bed and rifles near the wall, and the memory of prayers in the dark. It held the breath of a family refusing to give the wilderness more than it could take. Now the room is light enough to see the quilt clearly again. A square from an old dress, a strip from a work shirt, a corner patched twice. What looked in the night like one dark weight becomes in morning a record of care. The cabin itself does something similar at dawn. Its roughness can almost look dignified. Daylight forgives what darkness made severe. The cracks and the chinking are visible now, but less intimate. The ash around the coals glows more honestly. The straw bed looks poor, but not impossible. Morning always lends a frontier shelter a little mercy. If your thoughts are still here, let them rest not on hardship alone, but on the strange skill with which human beings create safety when safety is not given to them. On the hand drawing ash over coals at night, on the body rising barefoot in the coldest hour, on the mother listening without seeming awake, on the child learning to curl inward and sleep anyway, on the quilt that remembers every old shirt and dress it came from, on the belief that prayer, objects, song, arrangement, and custom might help the darkness become livable, on Rebecca and all the unnamed women who taught cabins how to endure the night. Nothing more is required of you now. Not the wolves, not the wind, not the arithmetic of firewood, not the great frontier myth with all its bright masculine noise, not even the careful correction to that myth. They can all wait in the daylight, for now there is only the cabin after the fire has been fed. The hush that comes after the hardest hour has passed. The pale gray entering the room, the warmth, still small, but growing. Let the north wall keep its whistle a while longer. Let the dog sleep at your feet. Let the children breathe. Let the wilderness recede to the edges of hearing, and as the long cold night loosens at last and the cabin, rough and drafty and somehow still sufficient, begins once more to pass from darkness into another day, you drift with it, away from vigilance, away from winter arithmetic, away from the strained listening of the middle hours, into the gentler silence that follows endurance, into the fire-warmed gray, into the morning hush, into rest, into sleep.